The Zeke came out of nowhere. 1 second, I was scanning the horizon through my F6F Hellcat's windscreen, watching the pale blue morning sky merge with the darker Pacific waters 20,000 feet below. The next, tracers were zipping past my starboard wing like angry hornets, and I was yanking the stick hard left, my harness cutting into my shoulders as 4Gs pressed me into my seat. The familiar growl of my Pratt and Whitney R2800 filled the cockpit as I rolled inverted, looking up or down, depending on your perspective, to see a Mitsubishi A6M Zero banking away, already lining up for another pass. It was 0730 hours on June 19, 1944. My name is Lieutenant Commander James Harvey Flatley, Jr. Andy was leading VF-10 off the USS Enterprise in what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But standing there on the flight deck 2 hours earlier, watching the sun rise over Task Force 58, I had no idea I was about to witness the death of Japanese naval aviation. The past week had been a blur of preparation and anticipation. Ever since Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet had begun the assault on Saipan on June 15th, we'd known the Japanese would respond. They couldn't let us take the Marianas. Those islands were too close to Japan proper, too strategically vital. Intelligence reports suggested Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa was moving the first mobile fleet east from the Philippines, looking for the decisive battle that would break American power in the Pacific. What the Japanese didn't know was that we were ready for them. Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher had assembled the most powerful carrier force in naval history. 15 carriers carrying over 900 aircraft, protected by 7 fast battleships and scores of cruisers and destroyers. We had radar that could track enemy formations at ranges the Japanese could only dream of. We had the new VT proximity fuse for our anti-aircraft shells. And we had the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a fighter specifically designed to kill Zeros. I'd been flying Hellcats since early 1943, first off the Yorktown, and now as part of Air Group 10 aboard the Enterprise. The F6F wasn't the most maneuverable fighter in the Pacific. That honor still belonged to the Zero. But it was faster in a dive, could take tremendous punishment, and packed 6 .50 caliber machine guns that could saw a Japanese fighter in half. More importantly, it was forgiving. You could make mistakes in a Hellcat and live to tell about it. In a Wildcat or a Zero, one mistake usually meant death. Our intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Stebbins, had briefed us the night before. "Gentlemen," he'd said, spreading reconnaissance photos across the ready room table, "the Japanese first mobile fleet is approximately 350 miles west-northwest of our position. 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. Admiral Ozawa has roughly 430 carrier aircraft, plus whatever land-based planes they can throw at us from Guam and the other islands." He'd paused, looking around the room at the 36 pilots of VF-10. Most were in their early 20s, kids from small towns across America who'd learned to fly at Pensacola or Jacksonville. But they were good, survivors of 2 years of Pacific combat. "The old man thinks they'll come at us tomorrow morning," Stebbins continued. "Admiral Spruance wants to stay close to the invasion beaches, so we'll be fighting a defensive battle. Make them come to us." Now, as I rolled level and checked my 6 o'clock for the Zero that had just bounced me, I could see the wisdom of that strategy. All around me, as far as the eye could see, white contrails crisscrossed the morning sky. The radio was a cacophony of voices, calm, professional, deadly. "Bandits. 12 o'clock high. I got him. I got him. Break right. Break right. This is Steeple Base. We have multiple bogies bearing 270, Angels 20. The battle had begun at 0615 when radar operators aboard the Enterprise and other carriers detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft 150 miles out. Admiral Ozawa had launched 69 aircraft from his carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, a mix of Zero fighters, Valdive bombers, and duty dive bombers. But thanks to our radar advantage, we'd launched our own fighters while the Japanese were still an hour away. I'd been leading a division of 4 Hellcats as part of the combat air patrol when the call came through. All steeples, this is steeple base. Vector 270, Angels 20. Large bogey formation inbound. We'd climbed to 25,000 feet, using our altitude advantage to position ourselves between the Japanese formations and our task force. Below us, stretched across 20 miles of ocean, sailed the most powerful fleet ever assembled. The Enterprise was part of Task Group 58.3 under Rear Admiral John Reeves, steaming alongside the carriers Lexington, Princeton, and San Jacinto. To the north and south, the other task groups maintained similar formations, each built around 3 or 4 carriers. The Japanese came at us in waves, just as they had at the Coral Sea and Midway. But this time was different. This time, we were ready. The first wave hit us at 0800. I was leading my division down from 25,000 feet when I spotted them, a formation of perhaps 40 aircraft flying in loose sections, with 0 fighters providing top cover for VAL and duty dive bombers below. The VALs were obsolete, slow, and vulnerable. The duties were newer and faster, but still no match for a Hellcat. "This is Steeple Leader," I called over the radio. "Tally ho. 40-plus bandits, 10 o'clock low. Attacking now." What followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in 2 years of Pacific combat. In previous battles, Guadalcanal, Rabaul, Truk, we'd usually been outnumbered, fighting desperately to protect our ships or support our ground forces. But here, over the Philippine Sea, we had every advantage: numbers, position, training, and equipment. I rolled inverted and pulled through into a steep dive, my Hellcat accelerating past 400 knots as I closed on a formation of duty dive bombers. The Japanese rear gunners opened fire as I approached, their 7.7 millimeters bullets sparking off my armor plating and bulletproof windscreen. At 300 yards, I opened fire with all 6. 50 calibers, the familiar BRRRR of the guns mixing with the howl of my engine. The first duty disintegrated under my fire, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning away in my slipstream. I pulled up sharply, looking for my next target, when tracers flashed past my canopy. The Zara pilot was good. He'd used my attack run to position himself for a high side pass. But he'd made the classic Japanese mistake of trying to turn fight with a Hellcat. Instead of turning to match him, I pushed the stick forward and dove away, using my superior speed and diving performance to extend the range. The Zero followed, but couldn't match my acceleration. At 5,000 feet, I pulled out of the dive and climbed back toward the fight, the Zero now 2,000 feet below and falling further behind. By the time I rejoined the battle, it was nearly over. The Japanese first wave had been shattered, with only a few aircraft managing to continue toward our task force. Our radar-controlled fighter direction had vectored multiple divisions of Hellcats onto the incoming formations, breaking them up long before they could coordinate their attacks. But this was only the beginning. At 0900, the Japanese launched their second wave, 107 aircraft from carriers Hiyo, Raiho, and Junyo. Then, at 1000, a third wave of 47 aircraft. Finally, at 1100, a fourth wave of 82 planes from Guam and other land bases. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were now converging on Task Force 58. We met each wave with overwhelming force. Admiral Mitcher had positioned his carriers perfectly, using radar to track the incoming raids and vectoring fighters to intercept them at maximum range. The Japanese, flying without radar and often without adequate navigation equipment, found themselves scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean, easy prey for our coordinated defensive fighter sweeps. I was leading my second sortie of the day when we intercepted the third wave. My Hellcat carried 6 50 caliber machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, plus a full load of fuel. We'd taken off from the Enterprise at 0945, climbing to 30,000 feet to position ourselves between the Japanese formation and our ships. "This is Steeple Leader," I called to my wingman. "Bandits, 2 o'clock low, about 30 aircraft. Zeros, Vals, and what look like some of those new Judy dive bombers. We'll take the high section first, then work our way down." The attack developed exactly as we'd practiced countless times in training. My division of 4 Hellcats dove on the Zero escort from out of the sun, achieving complete surprise. The Japanese pilots were flying in loose formations, apparently unaware of our approach until we opened fire. My first target was a Zero flying perhaps 500 feet above a formation of Val dive bombers. I closed to 200 yards before firing, my tracers stitching across his port wing and fuselage. The Zero rolled left and tried to dive away, but I followed, keeping my gun sight on him as pieces of his aircraft began to fall away. At 100 yards, I gave him another burst, and his engine exploded in a gout of flame and smoke. The pilot bailed out, his parachute opening just before he hit the water. Banking left to avoid debris, I looked for my next target. Below me, the remaining Zeros were trying to form a defensive circle, but our attack had scattered their formation. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, flying as my wingman, had just shot down 2 Vals in quick succession. His Hellcat was positioned perfectly for a deflection shot on a 3rd bomber, and I watched as his tracers found their mark. The Val's port wing folded upward, and the aircraft spun into the sea. But it was the radio chatter that really told Thestry of what was happening across the entire battlefield. "Got another one. Watch your 6. Red 3. This is Tomcat Leader. Scratch 1 Val. They're everywhere. I count 6 splashes off my starboard beam." The Japanese formations were being systematically destroyed. Their pilots, many of them hastily trained replacements for the veterans lost at Midway and Guadalcanal, were no match for our experienced pilots flying superior aircraft. More importantly, their attacks were uncoordinated. Individual aircraft or small groups would break off to attack our ships, but without mutual support or proper timing, they were picked off one by one. What few Japanese aircraft survived the fighter screen faced another nasty surprise: the most concentrated anti-aircraft barrage in naval history. Task Force 58's gunners had been training for this moment since 1942, and they were ready. I was orbiting at 15,000 feet, providing high cover for our task groups, when I saw the first Japanese aircraft break through our fighter screen. A lone Judy dive bomber, its port wing trailing smoke, was diving on the carrier Bunker Hill from 12,000 feet. I rolled over and dove after him, but I was too far away to intercept. Then the ships opened fire. I'd seen our anti-aircraft defenses in action before, but nothing like this. Every ship in the task group, carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, opened up simultaneously. The new 5-inch/38 guns with VT proximity fuses created a wall of exploding steel that seemed to fill the entire sky. The smaller 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon guns added their own deadly pattern, creating a cone of fire that no aircraft could hope to penetrate. The Judy never had a chance. At 6,000 feet, still in its dive, it flew into a cluster of VT shell bursts and simply disintegrated. Pieces of aircraft rained into the sea around the Bunker Hill, but the carriers steamed on unharmed. This scene was repeated dozens of times throughout the day. Japanese aircraft that survived our fighters found themselves flying into a storm of accurately directed anti-aircraft fire. The proximity fuses were particularly effective. Instead of requiring a direct hit, the shells would explode when they sensed an aircraft nearby, filling the air with deadly shrapnel. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, commanding VF-3 from the Lexington, later described it perfectly. It was like watching someone throw eggs against a brick wall. By noon, the Japanese had lost over 200 aircraft for minimal damage to our forces. The carrier South Dakota had taken a single bomb hit that killed 27 men and wounded 60, but she remained fully operational. Our own losses were almost negligible, perhaps 24 fighters shot down in air-to-air combat, with most of the pilots rescued. But Admiral Ozawa wasn't finished. At 1300, he launched what remained of his strike aircraft in a desperate attempt to reach our carriers. This final wave consisted of only 49 aircraft, many piloted by barely trained youngsters who had never seen combat. I was leading my third mission of the day when we intercepted this final attack. My Hellcat was running low on ammunition. I'd expended over half my rounds in the morning battles, but there were still plenty of targets. The Japanese formation was flying at 18,000 feet, heading directly for Task Group 58.2. They'd learned from the morning's disasters and were maintaining better formation discipline, with 0 fighters providing close escort for the remaining dive bombers. But it was too little, too late. "This is Steeple Leader," I called to the other divisions converging on the Japanese formation. "Let's finish this. Tomcat and Ringbolt divisions take the escort. Steeple Division will go for the bombers." What followed was perhaps the most one-sided aerial combat in the history of warfare. The Japanese pilots, exhausted from hours of flying over the open ocean and demoralized by radio reports of the morning's disasters, put up little resistance. Many simply jettisoned their bombs and fled westward, hoping to reach their carriers before their fuel ran out. I shot down 2 Vals in quick succession, both pilots apparently too inexperienced to take proper evasive action. As I pulled up from my second attack, I saw Ensign James Rigg, flying as my second section leader, destroy a Zero with a perfect high side run. All around us, Japanese aircraft were falling from the sky like autumn leaves. By 1400, the battle was over. The Japanese had launched 373 carrier aircraft and 58 land-based planes against Task Force 58. Of these, we shot down 346 carrier aircraft and 50 land-based planes, a destruction rate of over 90%. We lost only 29 aircraft in air-to-air combat, with most of our pilots rescued by our efficient air-sea rescue service. But the day wasn't over yet. As the afternoon wore on, Admiral Mitchell faced a difficult decision. Our combat air patrols had destroyed the Japanese air attacks, but Admiral Ozawa's carriers remained intact somewhere to the west. Should we pursue them, risking a night engagement that might favor the Japanese, or remain close to Saipan to protect the invasion forces? Admiral Spruance chose caution, ordering Task Force 58 to maintain its position east of Saipan. It was a controversial decision. Many of us pilots wanted to press the attack and finish off the Japanese carriers while we had the chance. But Spruance's primary mission was to protect the amphibious forces, and he wasn't about to risk his carriers in a night battle. However, our submarines were already hunting Ozawa's fleet. At 0920 that morning, the USS Albacore under Commander James Blanchard had fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the Japanese flagship Taiho. One torpedo struck the carrier just forward of the island, causing serious but not immediately fatal damage. Then, at 12:20, the USS Cavallo under Commander Herman Kostler put 4 torpedoes into the veteran carrier Shokaku, sending her to the bottom with most of her air group. The Taiho, damaged by the Albacore's torpedo, succumbed to progressive flooding and aviation fuel vapors at 1628, taking Admiral Ozawa's entire staff and 1,650 men with her. In a single day, the Japanese had lost 3 fleet carriers and most of their trained pilots. As evening approached, I found myself back aboard the Enterprise, helping to spot aircraft for the night recovery. Our flight deck was crowded with Hellcats, many showing battle damage from the day's fighting. Bullet holes, patched with aluminum tape, dented wingtips, scorched paint from near misses. But most importantly, nearly all of our aircraft had returned. In the ready room, the atmosphere was subdued despite our overwhelming victory. We'd just witnessed the destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force, but the cost in human terms was staggering. Over 400 Japanese pilots and aircrew had died that day, many of them kids barely out of training. It was a sobering reminder that even lopsided victories come at a price. June 20th dawned clear and calm, with excellent visibility. Admiral Mitcher had convinced Admiral Spruance to let him pursue the retreating Japanese fleet, and at first light, our search planes fanned out to the west. At 1540, Lieutenant Robert Nelson, flying an Avenger from the Enterprise, spotted Admiral Ozawa's surviving carriers 275 miles away at the extreme range of our aircraft. Mitcher didn't hesitate. Despite the late hour and the certainty that many aircraft would have to return in darkness, he ordered a full strike, 216 aircraft from Task Force 58's 11 carriers. I led 12 Hellcats from VF-10 as escort for the torpedo bombers and dive bombers, knowing we'd be pushing the limits of our fuel capacity. The flight west seemed to take forever. Below us, the Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional whitecap or cloud shadow. At 1840, just as the sun was beginning to set, we spotted the Japanese fleet spread across 20 miles of ocean. 6 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 20 destroyers. But something was wrong. The Japanese carriers were making no attempt to launch aircraft. Their flight decks were empty, their air groups destroyed in the previous day's fighting. Admiral Ozawa's fleet was defenseless. "This is Steeple Leader," I called to the strike group. "Target is 6 carriers in 2 groups. Hellcats will provide high cover. Dive bombers take the near group, torpedo planists far group. Let's make this quick, we've got a long flight home." What followed was more like target practice than aerial combat. With no defending fighters and minimal anti-aircraft fire, our dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked the Japanese carriers almost at will. The carrier Hiyo took 2 torpedo hits and began listing immediately. The light carrier Ryoho was damaged by near misses. 2 oilers were sunk and several other ships took hits. But as satisfying as it was to watch Japanese ships burning on the horizon, I couldn't stop thinking about the flight home. We were 300 miles from Task Force 58, flying into a headwind, with barely enough fuel to reach our carriers in daylight. Now, with the sun setting, many of our aircraft would have to attempt night carrier landings, one of the most dangerous maneuvers in aviation. The flight home was a nightmare. One by one, aircraft began running out of fuel and ditching in the dark Pacific. The radio was filled with distress calls as pilots and crews prepared for water landings, hoping our destroyers would find them before the sharks did. "Mayday, mayday, this is Tomcat 7. Engine quit, ditching now. Position approximately 50 miles bearing 140 from base. This is Ringbow Leader. I've got maybe minutes of fuel left. Request immediate vector to nearest carrier. Enterprise, this is Steeple 4. My wingman just went in. I think I saw a life raft. I was leading the remnants of VF-10 home when my own fuel gauge hit the red line. The Enterprise was still 50 miles away, invisible in the darkness ahead. My Hellcat's engine was running rough, starved for fuel, and I could feel the aircraft losing power. Then, like a miracle, I saw lights ahead. Admiral Mitcher had made the controversial decision to illuminate Task Force 58. Destroyers fired star shells, carriers turned on their flight deck lights, and cruisers sent up searchlight beams. It was dangerous. Submarines could spot the task force from 50 miles away, but it was our only chance to recover the strike aircraft. I approached the Enterprise with my fuel gauge reading empty, my engine coughing intermittently. The landing signal officer, illuminated by the flight deck lights, gave me the cut signal just as my engine quit completely. My Hellcat hit the flight deck hard, caught the number 3 wire, and rolled to a stop. I'd made it home with perhaps 2 minutes of fuel remaining. Not everyone was so lucky. Of the 216 aircraft launched that afternoon, 20 were shot down by Japanese anti-aircraft fire, and another 80 ditched in the ocean when they ran out of fuel. However, our rare sea rescue service was remarkably effective. Of the 209 aircrew who went into the water, 160 were rescued by our destroyers and submarines. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. In 2 days of fighting, we had destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. The Japanese lost nearly 600 aircraft and 3 fleet carriers, while American losses totaled only 123 aircraft and no ships sunk. More importantly, Japan had lost most of her remaining experienced pilots, men who couldn't be replaced. Some criticized Admiral Spruance for being too cautious, for not pursuing Ozawa's carriers more aggressively on the first day. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of how one-sided the aerial combat had been. But Spruance had accomplished his primary mission, protecting the invasion of Saipan. The amphibious forces were safe, the beachhead was secure, and Japan's ability to interfere with future operations in the Central Pacific had been eliminated. As I sat in my stateroom that night, writing my after-action report, I tried to make sense of what we'd accomplished. We'd just fought the largest carrier battle in history, and won it so decisively that Japan would never again be able to mount a serious carrier offensive. Their remaining carriers would be relegated to training duties or used as decoys in future battles. But the victory had come at a cost that went beyond the numbers. We'd watched hundreds of young Japanese pilots die in futile attacks against our overwhelming defenses. Many were barely out of training, kids who'd been rushed into combat without adequate preparation. They'd fought bravely, but they never had a chance against our radar-controlled defenses and experienced pilots flying superior aircraft. The war would continue for another 14 months, but June 19-20, 1944, marked the end of Japan's ability to challenge American naval supremacy in the Pacific. From now on, our carriers would operate with virtual impunity, striking targets throughout the Western Pacific and supporting amphibious operations from the Philippines to Okinawa. 79 years later, historians still debate the tactical and strategic implications of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Some argue that Admiral Spruance should have been more aggressive in pursuing the Japanese fleet. Others contend that his cautious approach was exactly right, given his primary mission of protecting the Saipan invasion. What's not debatable is the battle's outcome and significance. In 2 days, the United States Navy had achieved complete air superiority in the Pacific. Japan's carriers would never again pose a serious threat to American operations. The path to the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and ultimately Japan itself lay open. For those of us who fought in the battle, the memories remain vivid decades later. The sound of our 2,800 engines warming up on a carrier deck at dawn. The sight of Japanese aircraft falling from the sky like broken toys. The relief of hearing your wingman's voice on the radio after a fierce dogfight. The terror of trying to land on a carrier at night with an empty fuel tank. But mostly, I remember the young men who didn't come home, American and Japanese alike. War is often described in terms of strategy and tactics, of victories and defeats. What gets lost is the human cost. The pilots who died in flames at 20,000 feet, the aircrew who drowned in the dark Pacific, the families who received telegram notifications that their sons were missing in action. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was indeed a great victory, perhaps the most decisive naval battle of World War II. It opened the door to American victory in the Pacific and hastened the end of the war. But like all victories in war, it came at a price paid in blood by young men who deserved better than to die so far from home. As I write this in my retirement, I often think about that June morning in 1944 when we climbed into our Hellcats, not knowing we were about to witness the end of an era. The age of the great carrier battles was drawing to a close, and we were among the last generation to experience aerial combat on such a scale. In some ways, we were privileged to be part of history. In others, we were simply young men doing our jobs in terrible circumstances, trying to survive and protect our shipmates. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as it came to be known, marked the moment when American industrial might and technological superiority finally overwhelmed Japanese skill and determination. It was the victory that made all subsequent victories possible, the battle that ensured Japan could never again threaten American control of the Pacific. But on that morning in June 1944, as I watched the Zeke's tracers flash past my cockpit, all I could think about was staying alive long enough to see another sunrise. Sometimes that's all any of us can do, survive the moment we're in and hope it leads to something better. The war would end 14 months later with Japan's surrender in Tokyo Bay. By then, most of the pilots who fought at the Philippine Sea would be dead, wounded, or rotated home. The carriers that had seemed so invincible that June morning would be broken up for scrap or sunk as targets in atomic bomb tests. But for 2 days in June 1944, we were young, we were victorious, and we held the fate of nations in our hands as we dove out of the Pacific sky toward an enemy who would never recover from the blow we were about to deliver. That's the story of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot as I lived it and remember it. Not as grand strategy or historical inevitability, but as young men in flying machines, doing what we had to do to win a war and come home alive.